Greetings and salutations, friends. I'm Evelyn the Vet here with episode 2 of No Cynicism, Just Criticism. I'm overjoyed that many of the people who watched my first video really liked the idea, and I am more than happy to make more. And new people have already requested a critique, so I'd like to formally say it in a video that if you want me to critique your gallery, leave a comment with a link or send it to me on DeviantArt. You can also send art from other websites, but please only send your own. Now let's discuss the artists in this video, who are all mainly focused on drawing cats or other creatures. Our first artist, Wendigo Spice, has a fairly small gallery as they've only been on DeviantArt for 6 months. The majority of their pieces are headshots, but there are 2 full-body pieces. The first thing I notice about their art is their thick, smooth line art. It's interesting how they apply it, as there are visible differences from when they use thinner, looser line work and thicker, tighter line work. The most obvious combination of the two is in this piece. Because of the many different parts in a full body that they aren't practicing as often, the effort that would go into consistent line work is instead going into focusing on visualizing and forming the areas they are less familiar with. Therefore, the inconsistent line work will persist until they are more comfortable with drawing full bodies, unless they start taking extra time with all of their drawings. Another thing I'd like to discuss in relation to Wendigo Spice's art is how much little adjustments can change an overall piece. I found this most notable in digital art because a sketch, line work with a sketch, and line work without a sketch can all look very different. Taking this piece for example, there are several small changes I'd like to make. First, River Leaf's ear is a bit too far forward. Let's move it back. Then we'll add another ear behind it. And last, I'm going to adjust the tears a tiny bit so they're flowing down the face better, as well as add highlights to the droplets. Very little has changed, but the effect on the overall piece is dramatic. I did similar edits on Forest Claw, including smoothing out his chin and nose. I like how the muzzles are slightly different to give the characters more personality, but I still thought the chin and nose were a bit too sharp. Also, I'm not sure if I completely like the highlights I added to the wounds, so I guess I'll leave that up to you guys to critique as well. But I mentioned how little changes can have big effects because sometimes a piece of art can go from looking great to looking good if you aren't careful while drawing. Back to Wendigo Spice overall, I really believe they're off to a good start. Practicing more with full bodies and paying close attention to the details in their art are great ways to keep improving. And I'm looking forward to seeing them improve, so why don't you join me? The next artist I'd like to talk about is Meteor Star the Archer. Meteor Star has been on DeviantArt for 4 years now, and their level of improvement is incredible. From one of their earliest cat pieces, aptly titled I'm Getting Better, to their recent cat pieces, you can see they are doing exactly that. But along with this improvement, they kept a clear love of fandoms they were in, oftentimes joining roleplay groups in different fandoms, and also for original works and species. They've also been creating complex illustrations with intricate backgrounds and poses, but these have improved immensely as well. One of the most impressive aspects of Meteor Star's art is that it wasn't made using a tablet. Despite this, they managed to have an impressive level of control. The line art is noticeably messy as a result of not using a tablet, but I think that in many cases this actually adds to their style. I believe they're also aware of this because when they create pixel art, it's a primarily lineless style, and they've clearly put more care into making sure the feathers on the wings don't have crossing line art. However, there are some anatomical choices they've made for their style that don't sit right with me. Oftentimes, their feral creatures are scrunched up, giving off the effect that there is little to no neck or space between the legs. This is not an issue with all of their pieces, but some look like there is no clear idea of where these different body parts should be placed. Meteor Star will also occasionally have heads much too large or too small in comparison to the body, but once again this issue is very inconsistent. The strange anatomy can also be seen in the way they draw limbs. They have a style that closely resembles real animal limbs, but I believe they elongate the haunches and forearms. Their paws are also much smaller in comparison, which makes the elongation more noticeable. The inconsistency for this anatomy is mostly dependent on whether or not the pose is relaxed or active, because while relaxed the limbs are drawn pretty much the same, but any active limbs can be completely different in terms of length, width, and overall form. I think this is a similar situation to Wendigo Spice. So much of Meteor Star's attention is going into the pose of the character that they aren't really aware of how much the actual anatomy of the character is being morphed to fit the pose. The heads can vary in size for this reason as well. I think the best way to address this would be the age-old art remedy, using references. I'm not saying art styles have to be realistic, but having a better understanding of how real creatures look while jumping, crouching, etc. will better inform the artist on where to start with their own style and where they can exaggerate it. While studying these references, try emulating whatever pose the real animal is in, but exaggerate each body part to the same degree. Then do this, but exaggerate the body parts in many different ways. Does this new style resemble the original creature? Why or why not? If you like the way the ears look, keep them. If the eyes look strange now, try something new in the future. I specifically brought up changing the anatomy to the same degree because I noticed that Meteor Star rarely changes how they draw the back paws of their characters even when they should, and even when they're slightly changing the width between the front paws. The pose of the left creature would look better if the front paw was further back, and there are so many missed opportunities for more unique poses here because they're confining themselves to drawing the hind legs in a familiar way. And in this piece the paws are different, but now the front legs look too similar and the head and body are very stiff compared to the curvy limbs. The anatomy is kind of all over the place, so while it's sometimes good to let an art style develop naturally, I think the Meteor Star has reached a point in their artistic journey that they should focus a lot more on what exactly the anatomical rules of their style should be, so that they can later focus on applying that style to different poses and pieces. But as of now, Meteor Star the Archer has an impressive gallery filled with interesting creatures and beautiful illustrations, all worth checking out. Moving on to our next artist, let's take a look at Shiri art. They fit more under the other animals part of the title, and they deliver on that aspect with dogs, wolves, dragons, Pokemon, and much more. These creatures are sometimes lined and given simple shading, but Shiri began creating more realistically rendered pieces moving into 2019. All of these pieces are very visually impressive, but there are some instances where some or all of the piece looks to be unfinished due to a lack of detail present in the shading. The difference in the quality of texture that results from this breaks the suspension of disbelief in the piece and makes many of her highly detailed characters look out of place in their backgrounds. There are also instances of this lack of detail for specific places of a character, which makes the piece look unfinished. As someone who has created realistically detailed shading a couple of times, I can assure you there's a reason I've only done it a couple of times. It's incredibly time-consuming and tedious, so it makes sense that Shiri wouldn't want to perfect every detail in a piece. But I think they should try to find a middle ground between their art that has line work and their art that doesn't. They have a recent piece that shows something very close to middle ground, with colored line work that match shading and highlighted areas, as well as softly applied fur replacing what normally would have been more lined fur. Developing this style to be a little more detailed would likely keep it simple enough to create faster than a fully rendered piece, and it could also be applied evenly so all the elements of the piece look like they truly exist in the same space. Another element that can break the suspension of disbelief in these drawings are the muzzles. There are several places where the muzzles are box-shaped, likely resulting from how the artist draws the mouths. As they moved into the more realistic shading, Shiri began to suppress the emotions of the characters, likely trying to get them to look realistic too. This didn't develop well, as some pieces could definitely benefit from a more exaggerated mouth. The strangest thing about the choice to make the muzzles look more realistic is that there's a very good example already of the realistic shading used on a character with an exaggerated mouth. Another issue with the muzzles is that they're unbalanced. The noses are often too large and the whisker pads of their muzzles look too small in comparison. The large size of the noses are fairly realistic, but when combined with eyes that have also been enlarged, the mouths continue to warp as they are shrunk in comparison. But otherwise, Shiri has fantastic grasp on anatomy, and it's clear they've spent a lot of time studying how these animals look in real life. Their most recent piece is also completely realistic, and it's quite breathtaking. I'd love to see more like it, and for their regular art style, they just need to work a little bit longer with combining the cartoonish and realistic elements, and then their art will be truly stunning. So I encourage you to go check them out so you can see their already great work get even better. Our last artist today is going to be Euphoria, who is a longtime friend of mine. Since I've seen her art almost as often as my own over the years, finding things to criticize in her art was almost as difficult as trying to find mistakes in my own work. So I got some help from Jeannie, who was also featured in the last video. I'd like to give her a big thank you, and I'd like to give you a big recommendation to check Jeannie out. But back to you, she focuses mostly on cat and human drawings, typically inspired as fan content or gifts to others. Her style is smoother and more flowing than other cartoon styles, allowing it to be molded slightly to fit many different compositions and atmospheres. However, a cute, simple style like hers means that elements of the drawing may look good separate, but when put together no longer fit. The most prominent example of this is that many times when she draws full body pictures, the cat heads are much smaller compared to the rest of the body. It almost looks like the paws are supposed to be the focus of the drawing instead of the head, as the size difference pushes the paws towards the foreground. The right character in this piece has a very similar problem with his head being too small, and the overall anatomy of his body is pretty poor, including the very clunky, oversized hand. But Yu did say the art was old, and her most recent human drawings have a much better grasp of anatomy and hands. However, the size and perspective issue is still slightly present here, mostly due to his bottom leg being much bigger than it reasonably should be. I would also recommend defining the knee a bit more because it looks like his right leg is in front of the left one instead of resting on it. I would now like to talk about Yu's shading. Recently it looks like she's focusing on softly blended cell shading, which fits well with her overall style. There's also a piece from several months ago that shows the style of shading with highlights, which adds a lot to the feel of the piece. Using purple for the shading with solid pink highlights reminds me of Candy, and it fits the overall mood of the piece wonderfully, especially when combined with the bright blue in the background. I would like to see this style used more often for her pieces that aim to be cute and appealing, as recently she has only been adding shading and not solid highlights. While we're on the topic of her shading fitting the mood of the piece, I'd like to talk about how skilled Yu is at conveying these moods. This piece features the same drawing style as her other artwork, but the texture and unsaturated colors are different, which changes the overall atmosphere. The only issue I have with it is the eyes are a bit too small, especially since the expression is one of the main focuses of the piece. Looking at some other more experimental artworks, it's clear Yu has more than just a cute, simple style. As I said before, it is uniquely capable of being molded to be many different things. Because of that, I think one of the most important artistic things for Yu to do is to keep pushing her art style more and more. Looking back at some of her artwork from 2017 and 2018, there are more illustration-style drawings with enthralling expressions and lighting, many of them having atmospheres that hold up today. But they didn't quite have the style Yu currently has or the anatomical understanding she now has with humans. I'd love to see Yu bring these more complex illustrations back into her artistic pursuits and then watch as she uses them to grow her art more and more. But until then, it's nice to see snippets of exploration among artwork that is cute and lovely to look at. Therefore, you should all check her out to see what she decides to do next. And that brings us to the end for now. I hope you enjoyed your stay. I'd like to give another thank you to the artists that let me use their art in this video and to all of the people that gave me support on my last video. If you enjoyed this one, I'd like to ask you a favor. I'm not sure how YouTube handles tiny channels like mine, but I feel like my videos are reaching fewer people than they should be. Therefore, I'd greatly appreciate it if you would subscribe so you can see my future videos, and if you could share this video so that others can see it too. And if you're interested, please send me a link to any online art gallery you have, and I may include it in a future video. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time with an open mind.